In this episode, we're going to do something that feels a little different from pure new teaching, but it is still very much learning. We are going to revisit the essentials of Domain 1 using everyday language, so the ideas feel simple, stable, and easy to bring to mind under pressure. When people are new to artificial intelligence, AI, governance, and assurance, the biggest challenge is rarely memorizing a fancy definition, because definitions are easy to look up. The real challenge is building a mental map you can carry around, where you can hear a situation and quickly recognize what matters, what could go wrong, and what responsible oversight should look like. Domain 1 is fundamentally about that mental map because it covers the ethics, governance mindset, privacy discipline, and measurement habits that make AI controllable rather than mysterious. As we move through this review, think of it as practicing recognition, like learning to spot a storm by watching the clouds and feeling the wind shift, instead of waiting for lightning to prove you were right. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong, everyday language summary of Domain 1 begins with one idea. AI is not just a piece of software that runs in isolation. It is a system that influences people through decisions and recommendations. That influence can be gentle, like suggesting an answer to a support agent, or it can be heavy, like ranking applicants, flagging suspicious behavior, or shaping access to opportunities. The moment a system influences people, you must care about fairness, privacy, transparency, and accountability, because errors stop being merely technical and become human. Domain 1 keeps pulling you back to that human impact, because business pressure loves to push teams towards speed and convenience. If you remember nothing else, remember that responsible AI is about preventing predictable harm while still enabling useful capability. That means you look at the full life cycle, from the purpose statement, to the data choices, to the model behavior, to how humans use outputs, to how the organization monitors and responds over time. Domain 1 is the habit of asking, in plain terms, who could be harmed, how, and what guardrails must exist before you trust the system. Ethics is one of the first big concepts in Domain 1, and in everyday language ethics means choosing constraints that protect people when shortcuts would be easier. It is tempting to think ethics is a philosophical debate, but for AI oversight it is much more practical. Ethics shows up in decisions like whether a model should be used as a helper or as a decider, whether a high-impact use case should be narrowed until it is safer, and whether a team should pause a feature rather than gamble on a weak safeguard. Under business pressure, you hear soft words like just, temporary, pilot, or we will fix it later, and ethics is the discipline of turning those soft words into concrete questions. What happens if the model is wrong? And who pays the price when it is wrong? How easy is it to correct the mistake? And how often will mistakes be caught? Are we moving risk onto people who have the least power to push back, like customers, students, or applicants? When ethics holds up, it does not depend on someone's feelings in a meeting. It depends on decision rules that survive deadlines and excitement. Privacy is another Domain 1 essential, and everyday privacy is about expectations and respect, not just legal compliance. People share information in a context, and they usually have a mental boundary around what that information will be used for. A privacy failure often happens when an organization takes information from one context and uses it in another without a fair warning or a legitimate reason. With AI, privacy risk shows up in training data, in prompt logs, in output behavior, and in vendor relationships where data may leave the organization. The practical privacy mindset is to treat personal data as a liability that must earn its place, because more data might improve performance but can also increase harm. When you evaluate privacy, you look for minimization, meaning the system uses only what it needs, and you look for purpose limits, meaning data collected for one reason is not quietly reused for another. You also look for retention limits, access restrictions, and clear rules about whether prompts and outputs are stored. Domain 1 teaches you to validate not only what the organization claims, but what actually happens across the pipeline. Another Domain 1 idea that becomes clearer in everyday language is bias risk in data and behavior. Bias is not only about obvious prejudice. It is often the result of uneven history, uneven measurement, and uneven representation in datasets. A model learns what it sees, and if the data reflects a world where some people are missing, misunderstood, or treated differently, the model will often carry that forward. This is why Domain 1 pushes you to evaluate data input requirements for appropriateness, bias risk, and privacy fit all at once. Appropriateness asks whether the data truly matches the purpose, not just whether the data exists. Bias risk asks whether some groups or conditions are underrepresented, whether labels reflect subjective or uneven enforcement, and whether proxy variables might stand in for sensitive traits. Privacy fit asks whether the data belongs in the pipeline given the expectations and obligations involved. In everyday terms, you are checking the ingredients before you bake the cake, because once the cake is baked, fixing the ingredient choices is difficult and sometimes impossible. A related Domain 1 habit is testing for bias risk without getting trapped in heavy statistics. You can do a lot by checking coverage, balance, consistency, and labeling logic in plain ways. Coverage is about whether the dataset includes the people and situations the system will face, because missing coverage usually turns into failure. Balance is about whether some groups are present but too rare for the system to learn them reliably, because rare groups often receive worse outcomes. Consistency is about whether data is recorded differently across teams or contexts, because inconsistent recording becomes inconsistent model behavior. Label quality is about whether the outcome labels represent reality or represent past decisions that may have been unfair, because a model trained on biased labels will scale that bias. Proxy checks are about spotting fields that can quietly represent sensitive traits, even if protected traits are not included explicitly. Domain 1 makes this approachable by reminding you that an evaluator's job is to find risk signals that demand attention, not to prove perfection with advanced math. An essential Domain 1 lesson is that privacy risk can be created not only by what is in the training data, but also by what the model does after it is trained. A model can memorize details, infer sensitive traits, or produce outputs that help link information to identify people. Even if the organization removes names, a model can still reveal personal information if it learned unique patterns and can be coaxed into repeating them. Even if a model never repeats a secret, it can still create privacy harm by making confident inferences that feel intrusive or by encouraging users to paste sensitive content into prompts. Domain 1 encourages you to validate privacy risk by tracing pathways. What goes into the training pipeline, what is stored, what is learned, what can come out, who can access the system, and whether usage is logged and monitored. In everyday language, you are checking not only the locked door at the front of the house, but also the windows, the back gate, and the spare keys given to vendors. Privacy controls are only real when they cover the likely ways information could leak or be misused. Domain 1 also emphasizes evaluating the organization's privacy program, which is different from evaluating a single model. A program is what makes responsible behavior repeatable, especially when teams change and projects multiply. A strong program has clear scope for AI use cases. Early intake so privacy is considered before development is far along. Data mapping that includes training and prompt logging, and practical minimization habits that remove unnecessary information. It also has purpose discipline so data is not quietly repurposed, and it has rights handling processes that make sense when data is used in training or stored in logs. Vendor governance matters here too, because many AI capabilities rely on third parties. Incident readiness matters because models can leak information or be misused, and you need a response plan that works under stress. Monitoring and change control matter because risk changes as models and data change. When Domain 1 is working in an organization, privacy is not a surprise visitor at the end. It is part of how projects are proposed, approved, and maintained. Another Domain 1 theme is turning ethics and privacy into audit-ready controls, and that means linking principles to governance decisions and evidence. It is one thing to say the organization values fairness, privacy, transparency, and accountability, and it is another thing to show where those values become enforceable rules. The everyday way to understand this is that every important value needs a decision point, a set of criteria, and a record that proves the criteria were checked. Fairness becomes real when approval requires evidence of evaluation across relevant groups and a plan to fix disparities. Privacy becomes real when data sources and retention decisions are reviewed and documented, and when minimization and purpose limits are enforced. Transparency becomes real when notices, explanations, and appeal paths exist, especially for higher impact uses. Safety becomes real when testing, monitoring, and incident response are in place and are actually used. Accountability becomes real when owners are named and can show they made hard calls, including slowing down or changing course. Domain 1 teaches you to be skeptical of slogans and confident in evidence. Standards and regulations also appear in Domain 1, but the everyday language takeaway is that they function as constraints you can audit rather than abstract documents you fear. Whether a requirement comes from a regulation, a contract, or an adopted standard, it usually shows up as expectations around governance, risk management, data handling, transparency, testing, and accountability. The practical skill is to ask which constraints apply to the organization's AI use cases and how those constraints are mapped to internal controls. When an organization knows what applies, it can show a clear story of obligations and evidence. When it does not, it may be compliant by accident, which is fragile. Domain 1 encourages you to focus on categories that repeatedly matter: documentation and traceability, data governance and privacy, risk assessment and impact analysis, evaluation and testing, transparency obligations, and oversight mechanisms that allow intervention. You do not need to be a lawyer to audit these categories. You need disciplined questions and an insistence on proof. Constraints become manageable when they are translated into routine practices and clear evidence trails. A major Domain 1 habit is defining what good looks like in a way that is simple enough to use and strong enough to hold up under business pressure. Good looks like purpose clarity that prevents function creep, data governance that is traceable and minimized, risk assessment that actually changes designs, and testing that reflects real populations and real conditions. Good looks like monitoring and change control so drift and misuse are detected early, not after harm. Good looks like transparency that helps people interpret outputs correctly, and fairness discipline that surfaces uneven harm rather than hiding it in averages. Good looks like privacy choices that respect context and limit retention, and vendor controls that prevent third parties from reusing data beyond what was agreed. Good looks like accountability that is practical, where someone can say no and has said no before. In everyday terms, good looks like an organization that can explain what it built, why it built it, what it can and cannot do, and what it will do when warning signs appear. Domain 1 is where you learn to recognize that pattern quickly. Metrics are the bridge between good intentions and ongoing control, and Domain 1 asks you to build measures that reveal problems before incidents happen. Key performance indicators, KPIs, tell you whether the system is achieving its purpose, and key risk indicators, KRIS, tell you whether risk is rising in ways that could lead to harm, compliance issues, or loss of trust. The everyday mistake is to measure only performance and ignore risk, because a system can look successful while becoming more dangerous. Domain 1 encourages a balanced view where you monitor performance stability, uneven outcomes across groups, user behavior signals that show trust is fading, and misuse signals that show the system is being applied outside approved boundaries. It also pushes you to define indicators clearly, tie them to owners and response actions, and report them in plain language leaders can understand. Metrics that arrive too late or that no one knows how to act on are not controls. The purpose of monitoring is not to collect numbers. It is to drive timely decisions that prevent harm. The review also includes the idea that monitoring and reporting must be governance useful, meaning it must support real decisions rather than creating a false sense of safety. Useful reporting answers leader questions like whether the system is stable, whether risk is concentrating in a subgroup, whether users are misusing the system, and whether changes in data or environment are causing drift. Useful reporting arrives at the speed of the harm pathway, not on a calendar that ignores reality. It includes thresholds or trend rules that trigger investigation and action, not just pretty charts. It assigns owners so anomalies become responses, not debates. It offers segmentation so averages do not hide uneven harm. It links monitoring to change history so teams can connect a metric shift to what changed in the system or environment. Domain 1 makes you think like a responsible operator rather than a passive observer. In everyday terms, if the dashboard cannot tell you what to do next, it is not a governance tool. Model drift is a perfect example of why Domain 1 insists on monitoring that leaders can understand. Drift happens when the world changes and the model's learned patterns stop matching reality, and it often appears first as rising uncertainty, rising overrides, rising complaints, or input mix shifts. Leaders do not need to understand the math, but they do need clear signals that reliability is weakening and that the system may be moving outside its approved scope of use. Domain 1 encourages you to track stability metrics, uncertainty trends, subgroup differences, and external change events that could explain the shift. It also encourages you to connect drift signals to realistic response options, like narrowing use cases, increasing human review, improving data quality, or pausing a feature until it can be corrected. Drift monitoring protects trust because unpredictable systems create fear and frustration, and they often lead users to overcorrect in risky ways, like entering more sensitive information to get better output. In plain language, drift is the system slowly losing its grip on reality, and metrics are how you see it happening in time to intervene. To close this Domain 1 review, it helps to hold the entire domain in one simple sentence. Domain 1 is the discipline of keeping AI systems aligned with people, rules, and reality over time. Ethics gives you the values and guardrails that keep shortcuts from becoming harm, especially when business pressure is intense. Privacy gives you the respect for context mindset that limits exposure and prevents surprises, with real controls like consent, minimization, and purpose limits. Governance and audit evidence give you the decision points and proof that values are enforced, not merely declared. Standards and regulations give you external constraints that sharpen what must be documented, tested, and controlled. What good looks like gives you a quick pattern for recognizing mature practice, and metrics give you the early warning system that keeps oversight proactive. If you can bring these ideas to mind in everyday language, you will be able to evaluate real AI programs with clarity because you will know what questions to ask, what evidence should exist, and what warning signs matter most.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.